Okay, so I'm going to talk about something less technical. It'll be rather business model oriented or socially oriented thing. My data is a recent movement in Europe and worldwide. It means individuals, ourselves, control utilization of our own personal data. Why this is important? Because personal services account for most values in society. In Japan, it's hard to calculate. 300 trillion yen out of annual GDP is accounted for by personal services, including purchases and medical services and education and so on and so forth. And also, much of GDP comes from paid, that's the fact that much of GDP comes from paid personal services. And also, there are many free personal services like domestic works and child care and taking care of your neighbors and so on and so forth. And that whole thing would account for 100 trillion Japanese yen per year. That's very much part of GDP as well. So my data is vitally necessary for improving personal services in several different reasons. One is data subjects' consent. Your own consent is necessary for using your own personal data. Personal data utilization must be based upon data subjects' consent in principle. Now, secondly, service recipients, those who receive services, should be able to utilize this data to improve services to them. In order to improve the services, the service recipients must have some free hands to manipulate their own services, own data. And the third thing is decentralizing data sharing management to many service sites is much more efficient than centralized management. So there are many personal services taking place at this moment. Millions of sites are running those personal services, including this classroom, because I'm talking to you, lecturing about something here. That's part of the services. There are so many services. It's totally impossible for somebody who controls, manages all these services in one centralized site. So that's impossible. And the only practical way to do this is to decentralize data management to individual service site. And second thing is data circulation for AI. Considering data circulation for AI, it's also very important to come up to this my data idea, because AI needs rich data for primary use and secondary use. And primary use is the use in actual operation of AI, and secondary use is use of data in training or R&D of AI. And of course, primary use is much more important than secondary use, because the real purpose of AI is actual operation or services to individual people rather than training or machine learning. Machine learning is not purpose, it's means to fulfill the real purpose. So primary use is much more important. And please note that if individual data is available for primary use, then anonymized big data is available for secondary use, because each person can consent to disclose his or her data for the sake of machine learning or R&D. So that's the relevance to AI. Let's skip these. Do you know GDPR? Who knows GDPR? Nobody. Some. GDPR stands for General Data Protection Regulation, which has been made up in EU or in Europe for the sake of protection of human rights about personal data. Sorry, I misplaced this picture. And this law regulation applies to all the personal data in EEA. EEA means European Economic Area, which is 31 countries, including EU. And this regulation is applicable not just to companies in Europe, but also to companies from many other parts of the world, like Japanese companies and Google, Amazon, Facebook, and so on and so forth. And also UK has a similar law, although they are apart from EU right now. UK has a similar law. So it's a Europe-wide sort of regulation. And this regulation came into force on last month. This year, May the 25th. There are many important articles in this regulation. For instance, Article 17 through 19 defines the right to correction, erasure, and restriction. That means you, individual person, has right to require to correct or erase or restrict the use of your own data somewhere up in the network. And Article 20 is a right to data portability. This is quite important in this lecture, and I'll be talking about more details about this. And Article 83 defines a penalty when companies broke this regulation. The amount of penalty is the maximum of 20 million euro and 4% of worldwide sales, annual sales, which is quite huge. So even big companies like Google or Amazon, if they have to pay this penalty, then that would be a huge damage to them as well. So all the companies around the world must comply with this new regulation. And this is data portability, which is a necessary condition for my data, because this allows each individual to gather all of your data. So data portability means data subjects can freely choose data users because data controllers must provide data to data subjects, himself or herself, in easy-to-use digital form, rather than, printed paper. It must be digital, electronic, so that data subjects can disclose their data to others in their own will. So if this data controller owns your own data, then they must disclose digitally the data to you, so that you can disclose the data or utilize the data by sharing the data with anybody else. That's data portability. That's the foundation of my data. So that's what's happening in Europe, and not just in Europe, but any other parts of the world, any companies around the world which are running the businesses in EEA must comply with GDPR. So this regulation is becoming a sort of de facto global standard. And also in China, something similar is happening. You are aware of some kind of totalitarian policies in China, such as cybersecurity law defines some governmental network censorship and data localization and so on. And also the People's Bank of China it has developed this nationwide payment platform, and they are also trying to develop new cryptocurrency in China that would allow the government to know all domestic cash flow. So who is paying what amount to whom and so on and so forth. That's under control of Chinese government, which is a very totalitarian policies. On the other hand, China has made this new personal information security standard in force on May the 1st, prior to GDPR. And what's important here is the content of the standard is quite similar to GDPR, right? So the Chinese government is trying to promote personal data utilization by allowing each individual to control his or her own data, because that's much more efficient than centralized control. And if personal data is utilized more, then the entire economy would be vitalized more. That would account for much more GDP growth and so on and so forth. And another meaning here is that maybe, very probably, the Chinese government is trying to cultivate domestic businesses in EU-like environment, right? And such businesses developed in EU-like environment can be exported to any other parts of the world, right? Globally applicable business models can be developed in this way. So that's the strategy of the Chinese government, I guess. So what about Japan? We definitely must follow GDPR as well in order to vitalize our economy and the culture and everything. Well, but data portability in several different domains are progressing in Japan as well. So for instance, the healthcare system reform is proceeding to be completed in 2025, 7 years more. If this reform is successful, then health data portability will be established in Japan. And this year, cashless movement is progressing. And if this is successful, then purchase data portability will be established as well. And also, e-portfolio, which is electronic learning or education record, will be employed in fiscal year 2020's university entrance examination system. So that would introduce learning and education data portability as well. And probably in the next revision of personal information protection law will be discussed in 2 years, that's 2020, the year 2020. And probably in that stage, the Japanese government will introduce things like data portability to make Japanese regulation to comply with GDPR as well. Otherwise, Japan will be still much more behind the other parts of the world. So this is healthcare system reform, part of it. The new system, the medical organizations are categorized into several types. Acute hospital or highly acute hospital must discharge patients in 10 days or 2 weeks or so. And the discharged patients will be hospitalized in recovery hospital or go home and will be taken care of by clinic doctors and or will be in elderly care facilities. And and the acute hospital must avoid rehospitalization of the discharged patients, because the cost for rehospitalization must be paid by the acute hospital, according to some very intricate system of Japanese health insurance. So, in order to avoid rehospitalization, acute hospitals must disclose patients' data to those guys, right? And these people, these hospitals and the clinics and elderly care facility must take care of the patient by consulting the data from the acute hospital in order to receive more patients to run the business. So they must be sharing patients' data with each other. And also, clinics must be sharing patients' data with each other in order to be certified to be exercising home medical care, and which requires 24 hours a day, 365 days year basis caregiving to the patients. However, as you know, most of the clinics have just one single medical doctor, and in order to provide this kind of service, the clinics must form some groups, and clinics must take care of each patients. That's the only way. So the clinics in this group must share patients' data with each other. So that's the second meaning of data sharing due to healthcare system reform. And also, this is a purchase data portability due to Open API of banking services due to revised Bank Act, which was in force this year. And at the same time, mobile payments are spreading, including Amazon Pay, Rakuten Pay, Print, Cash, and etc. And digital receipts must also spread as these services spread as well. So digital receipts means purchase data portability. You have your own electronic data about your purchase. What you bought, when and where, for which, for how much. And this is a learning or education data portability due to new system of university entrance exam from second next fiscal year, where admission decision will be based not only on examination scores, but also extracurricular activity data during 3 years at school. And that data must be composed by students themselves, and they must submit that data to universities they want to enter. So the tool to compose and manage that sort of data is called e-portfolio. So everybody, and the policy of next Ministry of Education, education, sports and science, I forgot the order, but next policy is to let everybody to manage his or her own data by e-portfolio from primary schools through to universities, and also after employment, all the life. So this is the final picture of e-portfolio utilization. And this must accompany data portability. That's a vital condition for the sake of education. So what do we need in order to enjoy this data portability? If your data comes to you, you must have this tool called PDS, Person Data Store, which allows you to accumulate your own data and to utilize the data by sharing the data with other parties. However, there have been several implementations of PDS, and most of them are based upon centralized data sharing technologies. Centralized data sharing requires some middleman who exercises centralized management of data sharing by setting up some servers or database or ID federation servers and so on and so forth. So this centralized management requires a lot of cost for introducing and operating those machines and the software systems and so on. What's worse is, What's worse is, maybe I forgot to mention that. Okay. Since the centralized manager, has access to all the shared data here, this whole data may leak, may be breached due to his mistake or his evil will, which is a huge risk. So centralized data sharing consumes a lot of cost, inviting a huge risk of data leakage. So let's now turn to decentralized data sharing, which has no such middleman. There's nobody to control all this data sharing. So there is no centralized server, centralized database here. So this is a very inexpensive data management. And also, there is no possibility of leaking all this data. It's very safe. It's very cheap and it's very safe. Much safer and much cheaper than the traditional centralized control. And let's skip this. So PDS systems can be categorized into two types. One is those with dedicated server for centralized control. The other is those which has no dedicated server, so there is no centralized controlling middleman at all. And most PDS implementations belong to this category. And PLR, which is main theme of this talk, it belongs to the lower category without any dedicated server. There is no middleman. And there are very few other PDS without any dedicated server, but these are lacking some very important functionalities or assuming very unrealistic preconditions and so on and so forth. So I should say PLR is the only practical and useful and safe and effective PDS. This is the mechanism of PLR. PLR manager is the main body of PLR, which is basically user application. It may be used by individual people, but also used by business operators. So you manage your own data in your personal terminals, like a personal computer or smartphone, and you share your data using PLR Cloud, which is just a collection of online storages like Google Drive and iCloud and OneDrive and so on, or Dropbox. So those who you allow to access your data can access your data in PLR Cloud. However, the data stored in your terminal or business operator's computer or in the cloud, the data is encrypted all through. And of course, the decryption key is not disclosed to the cloud operators, including Google and Microsoft and so on. So the communication secret is perfectly guaranteed. And what is more here is there is no cost for running this part of the whole system. This comes basically for free. You can use up to 15 gigabytes in your Google Drive storage, and also like 2 gigabytes or 5 gigabytes in your Dropbox or OneDrive storage, and so on and so forth. So the total technical cost for running this whole services, even if there are billions of users, is just the maintenance cost for these applications. Very cheap. So this is the summary of merits of PLR. It is very cheap, very secure, because it's decentralized, and also the stored data is encrypted, and there is no such functionality of PLR applications to store decrypted data or send decrypted data to some other places. And it is easy to use and versatile. Versatile in the sense that PLR can be used and just by individuals, but also by companies as well. Let's skip this, and this is PLR integrated application called Personally. It runs on multiple platforms, including Android, iOS, and Java, and it will be freely published late this year. And there are many functionalities as well. And also, this is experimental operation of PLR based upon some national project. So we are connecting PLR with medical information systems around the country. And what we are doing basically here is to connect PLR with existing EHR, which is a medical data sharing services, so that each individual patient can share his or her data with the local medical organizations. And in some areas, PLR is connected directly with medical organizations, so that patients and medical organizations can share medical data without any middleman at all. If you look at other countries, like India, they may be doing better than us, or maybe than Europe or the States. India is running this Aadhaar, which is a public personal authentication system, and out of 1.3 something billion population of India, already 1.1 billion of them has registered in this Aadhaar, so they can authenticate themselves by iris and fingerprint right now. That means they can readily create bank accounts and enjoy mobile payments if they have mobile phones or smartphones. And also, Indian government is planning to abolish actual cash and credit cards soon. Soon means 2-3 years, I guess. For the sake of better civil order and prevention of corruption, because corruption, bribery, and so on is based upon real cash, real bill, and real cash is necessary for those bad financial exchange, bad corruption, and injustice. Like if they are using real cash, then it is quite hard for the government to send money to poor families, for instance, because the clerks, government clerks in charge of that task steals the money if the money is in real cash. If the money is digital, that's impossible. The government can send the right amount of money to the right kind of people, the right poor families and so on, which makes policy, political function much more efficient. And what's more is not just the bank API which is necessary for mobile payments, but also any other private and public organization should publish their services as APIs with which you can share your personal data to enjoy improved services. So this is a picture. If those services publish their services in APIs, then you can combine these services by combining APIs, APIs by data circulation, data sharing, in such a way that you optimize a combination of those services freely for the sake of your own benefit. So this is very free society in terms of services. There is no entrance barrier, and people are quite free to use any kind of data, any kind of services. There is no enclosure of customers by the business operators and so on and so forth. Okay, and the final comment is the merit of my data for businesses. Of course, my data is beneficial to individuals, but it is beneficial to businesses as well, in at least two reasons. One is the reduction of cost and risk of accessing customers' personal data. If personal data is managed by the data subjects, individuals themselves, then companies don't have to manage personal data, or don't have to risk the management of personal data, like the data leakage incident from Benesse Corporation 4 years ago. And the second reason is the utilization of personal data by data subjects' consent. Since personal data is managed by data subjects, it's quite easy to use the data based upon data subjects' consent. And the third one is the most important, that is the possibility of sharing profit increased by increased data utilization in the whole society. So if personal data is utilized more in the market, then the profits, the total profit of the companies must increase, right? And if each company can have some share of the profit according to the contribution to the profit increase, then everybody will be happy. So companies will be happy to disclose that personal data they own to the data subjects, individuals, because that would benefit themselves. First 2 points could be illustrated in this picture, which is decentralized VRM. VRM stands for vendor relationship management, which is the reverse of customer relations management. So what this picture says is that somebody called mediator manages this shared cloud, which contains several catalogs in different categories. And sorry, I forgot to translate this part. The business operators write some of their products data into these catalogs, and customers or potential customers will be able to download the appropriate catalog in their own personal device and exercise matching between his or her detailed needs, personal data, and products in the catalog, without disclosing their data to anybody else, which is quite safe. And according to the results of the matching, he or she will be able to place order about the products, so as to buy that products or services from the business operators, which is much more efficient and safe and inexpensive than, for instance, Amazon's recommendation, because those recommendations or product search happening in the business operator's server cannot utilize very sensitive, very secret information about you. Everybody has some very sensitive secret which you never want to disclose to anybody. But so that sort of information cannot be used by business operators, but that information can be used by yourself. You can use those secret information to pinpoint the products that fits you. Okay, I'll skip this. If data controller disclose the data to individuals, then they will be benefiting by taking commission from the other business operators who has got money from the individual. According to this data controller's contribution to the profit of this business operator. So this is a summary of the entire talk. My data is necessary to improve personal services, which account for most of social value. And along that line, GDPR is becoming a practical global standard. And my data, or in particular, data portability is gradually spreading in Japan in terms of health data and purchase data and learning data and data portability in general. And PLR is the most secure and inexpensive means to implement my data. And on the other hand, developed countries like India have huge opportunities to rapidly, means in 10 years, realize smart societies more productive than presently advanced countries like Japan, the US, and the European countries. And we must be hurry in implementing my data, because my data is many merits for businesses as well. So thank you for your attention. Any questions or comments? So one lesson here is, for the sake of data circulation of personal data must be, centralized to the individual, himself or herself. Otherwise, it's quite difficult to utilize personal data, because personal data utilization presupposes data subjects' own consent. Any questions? Okay.
How about in Japan? How about in Japan, the data, personal data centralization? But I saw in CXO office, city office, we can provide some data.
Yeah.
And when we can get any certificate, they easily give us in tax office or.
Yeah. And of course, you have right to require your data from those data controller, including a city office and so on. But it is not guaranteed that you can obtain your data in digital form, according to the current Japanese personal information protection law. So I hope the law will be revised in a few years to comply with GDPR in such a way that personal data utilization should be promoted. However, there are so many obstacles, which is called so-called the problem of 2,000 different personal data protection law in Japan. So there are many local governments, nearly 2,000, and each of those governments has their own regulation which overrides the nationwide law. So some of these governments, local governments, prohibits digital provision of personal data to the citizens, which is quite is a huge obstacle to build a smart society in Japan, and which must be overcome somehow. Any other questions? Okay, thank you very much.